Today's lecture it's entitled Overview of North Korea's Post-Hanoi Summit Foreign Policy. So before we go into that though, I thought maybe I would kick off by talking a little bit about what happened over the last few days in Beijing, right? Because that's I think that's foremost in a lot of people's minds right now for people who watch that region of the world. So I don't know, maybe I can throw a question at the audience, for a change. What did you think about Kim Jung Un and Xi Jinping and Putin standing side by side in Beijing? I mean, what thoughts came to your minds?
I think the head of security liaison wants to start off. Yep.
One thing that I noticed was that 10 years ago, Park Geun-hye was there as the South Korean president, standing where Kim Jung Un was standing now. So, and I was thinking, was that a shift in Chinese policies, or was it just a natural way of taking care of developments? And so, I mean, no thoughts of that kind. I have no answer, but I noticed that. I thought that was quite interesting.
It's a very good observation. Yes, the difference between 2015 and 2025, and who stood where relative to Xi Jinping, right?
Yes,
Anyone else want to?
Sorry, and at that time, maybe Xi Jinping wanted to invite South Korea into the sphere of the China economic field. Now they wanted to somehow constrain or stop North Korea from going wild. I don't know.
Yes, I would agree with that assessment.
Someone else?
Anybody else in the room?
Yeah, Anna?
Yeah, I kind of saw it as a culmination of the partnership that's been, well, not just brewing, but been happening between North Korea or DPRK and Russia ever since their North Korea's agreement to provide, well, military personnel to the war in Ukraine. So it's scary to think about like how far they've gotten together. So it made a big impact and made me think about like how much more self-sufficient, not that you could really use that with North Korea, but how they've grown in that manner.
Liebe?
I gonna maybe jump a little bit away from Korea and also say, just from a China standpoint, it feels also as a culmination, use your word, also of the consolidation and at least like the rise in China's importance in recent years, because if you also, and especially post-Trump, because post-re-election of Trump, because although he was not at the parade, with Modi also coming over from India, signaling an Indian shift perhaps towards China, it is at least a testament to me that that Beijing is cementing its importance, and also as a mediator between all these different focal point resistance against the US-led West. If we can even speak about that anymore.
Okay, so I think for me, Kim's visit to Beijing held 4, I guess, points of significance. First, Kim Jung Un came across as a global leader, right? And secondly, not only does North Korea have stakes in an anti-US, anti-West movement or bloc, if you will, it is a key player. It is a key player in that movement, right? Kim Jong Un standing side by side, Xi Jinping and Putin. And third, the perceived de facto recognition of North Korea's nuclear status from China. Russian officials have implied that they regard North Korea as a nuclear state. They have not officially said that they recognize North Korea as a nuclear state, but Lavrov has said in the past that North Korea's denuclearization is out the window. And he made a similar comment, I believe, when he went to Wonsan in July. And lastly, this was a great time for Kim Jung Un to meet all of the like-minded countries, leaders of the like-minded countries that were gathered in Beijing, right? Global South, I know, is not a politically correct term to use for many people, but many of the leaders from members of Global South were there in Beijing, right? And those are the countries that North Korea has said it wanted to step up relations with. So it was an opportunity for Kim Jong Un to meet with all of them, right, in person and exchange greetings. So in a way, really an opportunity to increase diplomatic leverage with these like-minded countries. For example, Kim Jong Un extended an invitation to the Belarusian president to come to Pyongyang. So I think that's an example. And of course, Belarus, as we all know, is a key partner for Russia. So we can also see how North Korea is using Russia to diversify its relations, political and economic, with other countries. So the relationship with Russia is just not just about Russia, right? It's about using Russia also for other things, which we can get to a little bit later. And I know that this is maybe perhaps a little bit outside the purview of the topic, which is foreign policy, but just because there has been so much interest in the daughter who accompanied Kim Jong Un to Beijing, I was surprised to get so many questions from reporters over the last 2 days, not about the significance of North Korea's participation in the military parade, but really the questions were more about the daughter. Like, what is the significance of the daughter being in Beijing with her father? You know, does this mean that she is the successor? And I would just say, I don't want to go into this for too long, but you know, the daughter, and from what we know, her name is Jue. She was born in 2013 or around 2013. So that would make her 12 years old. And Kim Jong Un is 41 years old, from what we know. We don't know for sure what year he was born in, but we think he was born in January 1984, so that would make him 41. We know that Kim Jong Un has a lot of health problems, but despite that, he's still relatively young. So I guess my point is that all of these things that we're seeing with the daughter, you know, appearing with her father here and there, would seem to reinforce the notion that has been out there for some time that she is the successor. And her visit to Beijing, you know, would further reinforce that thinking. I think what is more important is why Kim Jong Un is taking her around, and not so much whether she is the successor or not. I mean, you know, time will tell whether she's the successor. In my opinion, I think it's premature to say whether she's the successor. In the past, North Korea has carried out succession campaigns very differently, very, very differently. They took their time. It took as many as 10, 15 years, maybe even 20 years to bring out the successor, getting the top officials in the North Korean leadership system to buy into the notion of hereditary succession, to buy into the notion of who the successor might be, and rolling this out to the public. So in the media propaganda domain was a whole nother story. So if this is a succession campaign, what they're doing with the daughter, I think it's fair to say that they're doing this very differently. So that would be my take on the daughter. I thought I would just touch upon that because there's such an amount of interest in the daughter. So now let me get into the landscape of the foreign policy, the Post-Hanoi Summit foreign policy. So let's talk about the landscape following the collapse of the Hanoi Summit, as you know, took place in February 2019. So there are two main takeaways, really. the profound psychological impact that the summit had on Kim Jung Un. It resulted in a turn to conservatism across all policy areas in North Korea, domestic policy, foreign policy. And this was really to prepare for North Korea for a long-term confrontation with the United States, including the resumption of weapons testing. And secondly, the changing geopolitical landscape and how North Korea perceived that change. Intensifying great power competition. One other major component here is the chaotic US pullout from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. I think North Korea saw that as a case and example of a significantly weakened United States on the global stage, and really symbolizing or ushering in a multipolar global order. And Kim Jung Un has himself in public speeches has said that this world is now a multipolar global order. And I think what happened with the US pullout from Afghanistan played a substantial role. And the reason I think this is not a mere guess. It's based on the intense amount, the amount of attention that North Korea paid to that event, right? The pullout, how the US pulled out from Afghanistan. There was a lot of interest in North Korean propaganda. And we know that they were tracking this very closely. And I do think that it figured into their way of thinking about the US. So putting these two together, the psychological impact on Kim Jong Un, maybe questions arising in Kim Jong Un's mind and in the top officials' minds about what the United States can actually do for North Korea in the long term, right? And plus the changing political landscape, geopolitical landscape. I think when you put the two things together, I think resulted in North Korea fundamentally reassessing the strategic value of the United States for North Korea's foreign policy. North Korea's foreign policy, starting in early 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, after China and Russia normalized relations with South Korea, and North Korea started to then think about its own position in the world, right? And really wanted to improve relations with the US. So since that moment, the US became the centerpiece of North Korea's foreign policy. So meaning improving relations with the US by working toward denuclearization, and really using the United States as a buffer against China and Russia. So, pivoting toward Russia, maybe pivoting is not the right word, but improving relations with the United States and pivoting away from China and Russia. So those were really the key components of North Korean foreign policy, until North Korea started to shift its foreign policy in recent years, which we will get into. So what does North Korea's US policy look like right now? And I would like to take us back to the 8th Party Congress in January 2021, where North Korea announced a 5-year defense development plan that was heavily focused on enhancing North Korea's nuclear capabilities. So that really darkened the prospects for North Korea's denuclearization. But the important thing here is that North Korea officially did not roll back denuclearization, did not officially renounce denuclearization. So that was January 2021. September 2022, and of course, this was some months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea revised its nuclear law, which broadened the scope of nuclear strike targets to implicitly include South Korea and Japan, and also declaring North Korea's right to a preemptive nuclear strike. So on the same day that this law was revised, Kim Jung Un gave a speech at the North Korean parliament, where he, in effect, renounced North Korea's 30-year policy of normalizing relations with the US by working toward denuclearization. He used expressions like, there's no more bargaining over our nuclear programs, and we have drawn a line of no retreat on our North Korea, our nuclear program. Now, I should note that he did say he didn't completely rule out denuclearization. I said he, in effect, ruled out denuclearization. He did not completely. The reason I say this is because he said, if our nuclear policy were to change, the world has to change, and the military and political environment in the region has to change. So he left a little bit of room, but the thing here is that that is a very, very high bar. And Kim Jung Un knew that. That's why I said that he in effect renounced denuclearization. So he left a little bit of room, but not a lot. So what did Kim Jong Un mean then by the political and military environment in the region has to change? Based on North Korea's past government statements, official statements, that could mean, or that probably would mean, a complete halt to US-South Korea joint military exercises, no deployment of US strategic military assets to the region, and a significant downsizing of US Forces Korea, or withdrawal of US Forces Korea. And this is based on North Korea's past statements and, their past demands to the US and South Korea. So this was September 2022, right? So the following year, in September 2023, North Korea codified into its constitution that it would continue to develop nuclear weapons. It codified its nuclear weapon state, a nuclear state or status into its constitution. So you can see North Korea ramping this up, right, and making it harder and harder to negotiate with the United States. 2024 to 2025, we saw a steady stream of North Korean official statements and public remarks by Kim himself that North Korea will never change its line of bolstering up its nuclear forces. So this has been very consistent. We have not seen any change. And in fact, North Korea, Kim Jung Un visited a missile facility just one day before he left for Beijing. And he said that he talked about a decision for a longer term plan for missile development or missile production. He mentioned long term. So we don't see North Korea letting up. So in some, right now, the latest review of North Korea's latest public statements about or on North Korea would indicate that North Korea continues to criticize the US in public, but significantly, it has shied away from criticizing Trump himself. So what this indicates is that North Korea is leaving the door open for a Kim-Trump summit, not right away, but at a time of Kim Jong Un's choosing. And so you might at this juncture ask, well, then what would be a time of Kim Jong Un's choosing? And I would venture to guess that would be sometime in 2026, after the 9th Party Congress in January 2026. There aren't that many months left this year, right? And North Korea is going to focus for the rest of the year, concentrate on finishing the tasks laid out during the 8th Party Congress in 2021. This is the last year for completing those 5-year taskings. And in January 2026, the next Party Congress, or the 9th Party Congress, will be held. And that's a nice time for North Korea to review what happened, right, policy-wise, over the past 5 years, and then also, give its vision of various policy issues, including foreign policy. So that is why I'm willing to guess that a Kim-Trump summit may happen sometime in 2026. But when this, and we can talk about we'll talk about this later, but the dialogue, if it does happen between Kim and Trump, will take place on Kim's terms, and it will not be on the terms of the United States. And we'll talk about this more a little bit later. So that's an overview of U.S. policy. North Korea's Russia policy, what does that look like? We've heard about this a lot in recent years, right? So the pivot, unlike what many people think, which is that North Korea started to pivot to Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. My assessment is different. The pivot started really in the summer of 2021, in the wake of the the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it was not after the war started in Ukraine. However, the war in Ukraine accelerated North Korea's pivot to Russia, but it did not start with the war in Ukraine. We have heard about the relationship so much over the past few years, but I thought I would just lay down here some of the milestones in that relationship. I think the key thing for me was July 2023, when a Russian Defense Ministry delegation visited North Korea to celebrate North Korea's War Victory Day, or the end of the Korean War. So North Korea held a military parade to mark that event, and a Russian Defense Ministry delegation was invited and received lavish treatment from Kim Jung Un himself. By contrast, there was also a high-level Chinese delegation there, and Kim Jung Un gave the Chinese delegation the cold shoulder. All of his attention was on the Russians. And what an irony that was, because this event, right, the end of the Cold War, July 27, this is an event that North Korea traditionally celebrated with the Chinese, for the reason that it was the Chinese People's Volunteer Army that played a decisive role in preventing North Korea's collapse during the Korean War. The Soviets provided some assistance, but they didn't send any soldiers, right? They sent some pilots, aircraft, but it was really the Chinese that saved the day for North Korea during the Korean War, and hence the reason why historically this was an event for celebrating with the Chinese, not the Russians. So the very fact that North Korea invited such a high-level Russian delegation, and of all delegations, military delegation, was very telling. And in a way, I do wonder if the cracks between North Korea and China already started to appear then, by the mere fact that North Korea invited the Russians to this event. So that was July 2023. September 2023, Kim Jung Un, of course, traveled to the Russian Far East for a summit with Putin. And then that was when we started to see high-level exchanges begin, right? And then, of course, June 2024, Kim Jong Un, Putin met again for a summit in Pyongyang, signed the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, covered all areas from political, economic, and military to cyber. And of course, it includes Article 4, which many of you have heard about probably, known also as a military intervention clause, where if one state is placed in a state of war by an armed invasion from another state, then the other side shall provide military and other assistance. It should be noted that this is not an automatic military intervention clause, because there's a caveat in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and the laws of the DPRK and the Russian Federation. So basically, there is that caveat. So it's not automatic, but still military intervention. And it is based on this article that Kim Jong Un sent troops to Russia. And he has publicly acknowledged that it was based on the treaty that he sent troops to the Kursk region. October 2024, of course, North Korea started sending troops to Russia's Kursk region. And April 2025, North Korea and Russia, almost at the same time, officially acknowledged North Korea's troop deployment, and North Korea even implying that there were casualties. And of course, in recent months, they, officially acknowledged that there were casualties, right? We saw Kim Jung Un meeting with the families of fallen soldiers, right? So what is interesting, I think, and what is significant with regard to North Korea-Russia relations these days is the high-level consultations that we see. Steady, high-level consultations. How many times did Sergei Shoigu, who's one of the closest confidants of Putin, visit Pyongyang? He seems to visit every 3 or 4 months, right? And at pivotal moments, usually right before a troop deployment, maybe during he was there when the Israel-Iran conflict occurred in June also. I don't think he was there for that, but the timing was such, right? Also, we saw Kim Jung Un and Putin having a phone call, right, in August. And that was, I believe, the day before Putin left for Alaska for a summit with Trump. So we see these very high-level consultations between North Korea and Russia. And perhaps just as important is the institutionalization of the bilateral relationship at all levels, from the very bottom to the very top, and across all sectors. It seems like every week or maybe every other week, we see some delegation arriving from Russia or going to Russia. So what this tells me is that this is a longer-term relationship, that this relationship is not just for the duration of the war in Ukraine. Because if it was just for the war in Ukraine, there's no reason why they're doing this. I mean, it doesn't explain why they're going out of their way to institutionalize the relationship this way. So I think that for both countries, they're looking at a longer-term relationship, and I'll get to that in a minute, a little bit later, in terms of what is in it for both countries as to why they should foster a longer-term relationship between the war in Ukraine. For now, the benefits for North Korea. We have seen, of course, economic benefits, Russia's wheat and oil shipments, possibly cash for soldiers. Russia covers that extra political cover in the UN. Of course, Russia was the one that shut down the UN panel of experts for North Korea in March 2024. China abstained, Russia vetoed, right? So the panel had to shut down. Possible transfers of sensitive military technologies from Russia to North Korea. And North Korea, by having sent troops, has gained actual battlefield experience, right? How modern warfare is fought, including how drones are operated. And I don't think it's a coincidence that North Korea likes to talk about drones a lot these days. Kim Jung Un talking about the importance of developing drones and producing drones. Kim Jung Un also talking about the importance of modernizing the military. So I think these commanders, North Korean commanders, took a lot of notes when they were in Russia. And I think they brought a lot of lessons learned back to North Korea, and I think they're trying to implement some of that. Of course, on the diplomatic front, greater international prestige for North Korea. It may not be for the right reasons, but still, the fact that North Korea's comrades in arms with Russia gives North Korea that international boost, right? And then North Korea cementing its place in an anti-US, anti-West bloc, as I mentioned earlier. I think perhaps more important and perhaps more dangerous for the rest of the world is not these immediate benefits that North Korea is reaping from its improved relationship with Russia, but the perceived opportunities for Kim Jung Un. What opportunities does Kim Jung Un see in Russia, right? So I think things like access to multilateral platforms like BRICS, for example, alternative payment methods, that's something that Kim Jong Un and Putin have talked about. North Korea's opportunity, the opportunity for North Korea to diversify trade partners through Russia. I mentioned this a little bit earlier too. For example, Belarus, we have seen high-level Belarusian delegations visiting North Korea in the since last year. And we had not seen that level of Belarusian delegations visiting North Korea in the past. So it's not a coincidence. It's because of North Korea's improved relations with Russia, right? And also, and more importantly, perhaps, North Korea's modernization and revitalization of the defense and munitions industries. So North Korea's exports of weapons has forced or have forced North Korea to do that, right? To modernize, revitalize the defense and munitions industries. Also, this, was good timing because Kim Jung Un has wanted to revitalize these two industries for a while. He keeps talking about boosting weapons production and so forth. So these two things go hand in hand, right? Russia weapons exports to Russia, and Kim Jong Un's own ambitions at home on the defense and munitions industrial fronts. So I'm going to move on to China policy. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that North Korea started to pivot to Russia in the summer of 2021, right? So before the war in Ukraine. It was not just pivoting to Russia. North Korea pivoted to Russia and China, right, in the summer of 2021. And this is based on my research with Bob Carlin on the North Korean Foreign Ministry website. And the types of commentaries and articles that website was hosting. And the North Korean Foreign Ministry basically voicing support implicitly by writing these articles, siding with China and Russia on a number of international issues. So yes, aligning with China in the summer of 2021, and then it didn't. As I mentioned, North Korea started to move away from China as early as July 2023, when it invited the Russian Defense Ministry delegation to the War Victory Day celebrations and giving the Chinese delegation the cold shoulder. The relationship, seems strong, but then, North Korea moving away. And then since then, right, so the summer, maybe fall of 2023, the relationship becoming strained, right, visibly strained. And one clear example of the tensions in the relationship, I think, was shown in Kim Jong Un's letters to Xi Jinping in October 2023. So this was right after he came back from his summit with Putin in the Russian Far East. So the letter to, Kim Jong Un's letters to foreign leaders are a very good indicator of where North Korea's relationship with that country stands and where it wants that relationship to go, right? So Kim Jong Un's letter to Xi Jinping in October 2023 was very curt. It was noticeably shorter than before. And there was no mention of working jointly toward the common cause of socialism, which was, typical language in Kim Jong Un's letters to Xi. No mention of that. So that letter was a very good indication that something was happening between the two countries, and not in a good way. And of course, 2024 was the 75th year of forging of diplomatic ties between North Korea and China. There were no high-level exchanges. North Korea did all of that with the Russians, even though it was not really a significant diplomatic year for either country. I started to see some signs of improvement between the two countries since July of this year. So Kim Jong Un's letters to Xi Jinping started to include the language about common cause of socialism. And also we started to see higher level North Korean officials turning up in the Chinese embassy for functions and events. And they did not before July 2025. So those were some indications to me that maybe the relationship was picking up again. And then, of course, at the end of September, we saw the Chinese government announcing that Kim Jong Un was visiting Beijing, and as mentioned before, as we talked about at the outset of the session, Kim Jung Un being at the military parade in Beijing, standing on Xi Jinping's right, and also in the same line as, along with Xi Jinping and Putin. So what might we expect going forward, with regard to DPRK-China relations? I think it's hard to say. I think the very fact that he accepted Xi Jinping's invitation to come to Beijing itself would indicate that he has the intention of improving ties with China. But I think, to be sure, we would have to see how North Korean media covers the Xi-Kim summit that I believe happened a couple of hours ago, right? I think they just finished their talks. So we would have to see how North Korean propaganda covers or characterizes that meeting, and also how North Korean propaganda handles China in the coming weeks and months. Do we see more positive coverage? Do we see more coverage of China? So those would be some indicators. Basically, when it comes to North Korea's relationships with China and Russia, I think it's a balancing act for North Korea. I think North Korea is hedging, just like all other countries. North Korea got closer to Russia. One of the reasons that North Korea wanted to improve relations with Russia is because it did not want to be overly reliant on China for all things, right? Trade, economic security. Likewise, Kim, I think, is wary of being overly dependent on Russia for military technology, among other things. North Korea, Kim Jung Un himself has said a couple of times in public that it was an act of, it was a traitorous act to rely on foreign technology. So that suggested to me that there is concern within the top leadership in North Korea that they were becoming too dependent on Russia for technology. So you can see that North Korea doesn't like to be overly dependent on any one country. So I think one of the reasons why Kim Jong Un went to China this time around was because he felt the need to strike a better balance between China and Russia. But we'll see. We'll have to see how, again, North Korea covers the latest summit between Kim and Xi, and how its treatment of China, public treatment of China, changes in the coming weeks and months. Now let's shift over to South Korea. So you probably have heard some interesting things about North Korea's policy change. Maybe Kim Jong-un's sister's public statements, Kim Yo-jong's public statements criticizing the new South Korean government and the new South Korean president. So let's go back to December 2023, when Kim Jong-un announced what is commonly known as a two Koreas policy. So he basically said South Korea is a hostile state that is altogether different or separate from North Korea. So no unification with South Korea, two different countries. So the significance of that was that North Korea, Kim Jong-un threw out a decades-long unification policy, right? We often refer to Kim Il-sung's grand principles of unification, which I think he announced in 1974 as like the Bible, right, of North Korea's unification policy or inter-Korean policy. And Kim Jong-un basically threw that into the trash bin, right? And I think it must have been a shock to the North Korean people. There were a lot of signs leading up to this that North Korea was fundamentally rethinking its relationship with South Korea. So the decision was a strategic one. It was not made overnight. However, I think there are difficulties in North Korea in terms of implementation. So strategic decision that they're having a hard time implementing. And I think the difficulty of implementing that policy has to do with the fact that unification has been a core component of the North Korean people's psyche. Before this policy was announced, there was not a day that went by where North Koreans didn't hear about unification one way or the other. the word unification being all over the streets, being part of like street names, like monuments, you had unification somewhere on the monuments. North Korean media commentaries, articles every single day up until a few years ago. Every single day, there were unification-related articles and commentaries. So you can imagine the shock for the North Korean people when one day the North Korean leader gets up there at the parliament, gives a speech and says, oh, no more unification, and South Korea is not our compatriot anymore. We're different people, different countries, two different countries. So I think that is where the difficulty of implementing this policy comes in. So I did say that this was a strategic decision, that this decision was not made overnight. So the signs that we have seen, going back really to the fall of 2019, when North Korea stopped running articles and commentaries about unification. And then, of course, the Eighth Party Congress in January 2021 emphasized the development of tactical nuclear weapons. And this is relevant because the tactical nuclear weapons target primarily South Korea. And then, of course, the revised nuclear law that implicitly included South Korea's target of nuclear strikes. And then North Korea, you may have heard about this, North Korea using the Republic of Korea instead of South Korea. So Republic of Korea is the official name of South Korea, right? North Korea ceased calling South Korea the South or South Korea since July 2023. And since that time started to use Republic of Korea. So to really hone in on this idea of, okay, well, they're a separate country, right? We're not part of the same Korean nation anymore. So reasons for this policy change. Why did Kim Jung Un announce this policy? Why was this even necessary? I think there are, for any major and strategic decision, there's got to be more than one reason, right? I mean, there almost always is more than one reason. And I think part of it, and this is probably the one that you have heard the most, is that North Korea wanted to nip in the bud any hope for unification because of regime stability, because of the prevalence of South Korean culture, right? South Korean drama, South Korean movies, South Korea's fashion, just pervading North Korean society. So, this by announcing this no unification policy, defining South Korea as a completely hostile state, maybe North Korea wanted to enhance regime stability that way, again, by nipping in the bud any hope for unification. I think that was one reason. I think another main reason was that North Korea wants to exclude South Korea from any and all future nuclear negotiations going forward. North Korea wants to deal directly with the United States. It always has wanted to deal directly with the United States. That was always difficult, and there was never a time where North Korea managed to deal directly with the United States, right, without going through South Korea, without having to improve relations with South Korea first. South Korea was always in the picture. Going forward, I think North Korea wants South Korea out of the picture. It's kind of like when France wants to talk to the US about a major issue, right? Why would Germany be in the picture? That's, I think, what Kim Jung Un is thinking, or how he wants this to be perceived by the rest of the world. Hey, we want to talk about our nuclear program with the United States. What does South Korea have anything to do with this, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why he promulgated this policy of two Koreas. Also, I think one reason also is that North Korea's nuclear law now implicitly including South Korea as a target of a preemptive nuclear strike. I think in some ways it was necessary for North Korea to define South Korea as a separate state, because it would be hard to justify if that time came where North Korea had to launch a nuclear strike against South Korea. It would be hard for North Korea to justify to its own people that it was using nuclear weapons against the same brethren or compatriots. But against a different state or different country, it's less of a problem. So I think for me, those are maybe like three main reasons why North Korea needed to and wanted to announce this new policy on South Korea and unification. You may have heard about some of the latest statements from Kim Jung Un's sister, Kim Jung, about South Korea, and criticizing and berating the new South Korean president, despite the conciliatory measures that the new South Korean government has implemented, such as shutting off the loudspeakers at the DMZ. I think the radio broadcasts that were going into North Korea, they have virtually all of them stopped. I think the South Korean government has taken steps to ban NGOs from flying leaflets into North Korea. So basically, conciliatory measures. And North Korea has basically said, yeah, that's not really going to help because those things shouldn't have been done anyway, is their logic. And they're saying, it doesn't matter what you do, you are never going to change, and our two Koreas policy remains. So this was a broad sweep sort of overview of North Korea's foreign policy, right? The foreign policy landscape since the collapse of the Hanoi Summit. So then what does this really mean then, right? What does this mean? Implications, right? So for US DPRK, prospects for engagement. I noted earlier that North Korea, while stepping up or maintaining criticism of the US, has refrained from criticizing Trump himself. And that is an indication that North Korea wants to leave the door open for a Kim-Trump summit at a time of Kim's choosing. And again, I noted that it would probably be, if there is re-engagement, it would probably be sometime next year after the Party Congress. And that this year, North Korea will focus on domestic issues. The terms of dialogue will again come on Kim's terms and not Trump's. And this is because of the geopolitical situation. Really, North Korea is getting everything from Russia and China. There's really not much that the US can offer at this point. Back in 2018, 2019, North Korea was very much interested in the lifting of sanctions, and through that, improving the economy, right? And of course, the US plays a pivotal role in the lifting of sanctions. I don't think North Korea is interested in that anymore. Of course, if it can have the sanctions lifted, great, but I don't think it's viewed as a necessity. Again, because it has been able to bypass sanctions largely thanks to China and Russia. And the economic benefits, again, that it has been getting from Russia by improving its relations with Russia, right? We talked about wheat and oil shipments. Russia basically saying that it doesn't care about sanctions. So what can the US do then, really? The US can do some things, but I don't know that the US would do them, right? So we talked about how North Korea may change its nuclear policy if the US and South Korea altogether stop their joint military drills, if the US stops bringing in its strategic military assets like nuclear-powered aircraft or submarines into the region, if there is a significant downsizing of US forces Korea or withdrawal. Again, these are based on some of the conditions that North Korea in the past has laid out. What are the chances of the US meeting any or all of these demands? I don't think that possibility is very high. If not for North Korea, it's for China, right? The US has to contain the China threat in the region. So US forces Korea, strategic assets in the region, the joint drills, they're not just for North Korea. They're not just for deterring the North Korean threat. It's really more about China, especially for the Trump administration. It's all about China, right? So the chances of the likelihood of even for Trump to meet these demands is not that high, if there's any possibility at all. And so again, the bar for North Korea's return to the negotiating table has gone up, obviously, because of its significant advancements in weapons development since the collapse of the Hanoi Summit, but also because it is getting basically what it needs from China and Russia. So North Korea may return to the talks for maybe arms control, but any talks that include denuclearization, or denuclearization is part of the picture, I highly doubt North Korea will show up. It just has no reason. And, I mean, they codified their nuclear status in the Constitution. And Kim Jung Un has very consistently, in the last few years, has said, we are not giving up our nuclear weapons. So North Korea-Russia relations, as I mentioned before, I view this relationship as a longer-term strategic relationship rather than a short-term transactional relationship. There was a lot of debate up until maybe last year about the nature of this relationship, but given what I have said, institutionalization at all levels across all sectors, Kim's repeated and consistent expressions of full support for Putin and the war in Ukraine, and for these reasons, I don't think that they're shooting for anything short term. So just until the end of the war in Ukraine. So what's in it for both countries, right? A longer term relationship. I think post-war reconstruction efforts, we know that Russia needs manpower. North Korea has the manpower. And for North Korea, that means money. Russia also, I think, even after the war in Ukraine ends in one form, in one way or the other, Russia will probably need North Korean weapons to fill up its arsenals. I don't think Russian arsenals are teeming with weapons at the moment, and I don't think they will after the ceasefire or the end of the war. Possible industrial cooperation between the two countries, I think, is something that we need to think about and keep an eye out for. For example, the defense industry. Could the two countries be talking about defense industrial cooperation? I think that's a possibility. When we talk about DPRK, Russia, economic cooperation, there's a tendency to kind of poo-poo that notion because North Korea and Russia have gone down that route before of economic cooperation, and nothing really worked out after the Cold War. However, times have changed, and I think the need for each other is greater these days. So we may see a change on that front. Prospects for DPRK, Russia-China relations. Again, North Korea will need China's economic cooperation, right? China accounts for about 98% of North Korea's total trade volume. I think that has gone down a little bit over the last few years. And I think a little bit of that has been filled up by the Russians, but still more than 90%. And that's a lot. And what country can replace China? So North Korea will continue to need China for economic trade and possibly investment. You may have heard about the fancy Wonsan Beach Resort that just opened in North Korea. Initially, I think they're shooting for Russian tourists to come and enjoy themselves, spend some money. Some wealthy North Koreans may visit, but probably not many, and certainly not enough to keep up the resort and make some money off of the resort. What that means is that North Korea will want Chinese tourists, right? China has a lot of people that Russia does not, and that North Korea does not. So tourism, investment, economic cooperation will definitely be sought from China, from the North Koreans. I think China will play the role of complementing Russia, right? China has been hesitant and probably will remain hesitant to flagrantly violate international law because China still wants to be viewed as a responsible international actor, whereas Russia doesn't care about that so much anymore. So I think that's where the two countries will complement each other for North Korea. Again, I think despite the importance of China for North Korea, I think we as analysts will want to keep an open mind as to what North Korea's China policy will look like, instead of just, going back to the same conclusion of, oh, well, North Korea is never going to give up on China. But we're not talking about North Korea giving up on China, but merely the possibility that North Korea's policy toward China, how North Korea views China, may be changing. Just as North Korea has fundamentally shifted so many aspects of its foreign policy in the last few years, I don't see why we should not keep that possibility open for North Korea's China policy too. Inter-Korean relations, not bright prospects at all, as I mentioned, just given the latest Kim Jung Un's two Koreas policy, and also given the latest statements from Pyongyang about the new South Korean administration, I don't see bright prospects. I don't see engagement in the near to even the medium term. However, that is not to say that inter-Korean cooperation is not possible at all in the future. There is no reason why two countries should not cooperate with each other when there is a need, right? So I think it is possible that North Korea will take that approach, that if they see benefits in cooperating with South Korea, for example, maybe on the economic front, that we may see cooperation at some point in the future, but definitely not in the near term, and probably not in the medium term either.